We are ready to get started. I wanted to thank all of you for joining today. My name is Jennifer Morris. I'm with MadCap Software. And today I am so excited to have Neil Perlin with us, one of my favorite educators. Neil is a MadCap certified trainer and consultant. He's an author on various books on Flare and Mimic and a regular speaker at numerous industry conferences, including our own user conference, MadWorld. In fact, today's presentation is adapted from Neil's session at MadWorld 2018 here in San Diego, and it's all about Information 4.0 and Flare. So we're going to learn about what Information 4.0 is, how Flare fits into all of this, and what it means for the writing community. So we've got a lot to cover today. I just want to touch on some really quick housekeeping items as usual before we begin. So just a reminder to everybody, we will be recording this. So if you have to pop out early or if you can't stay for the whole thing, not to worry. We will send you a link to the recording as soon as it's done. There is also a questions panel in the GoToWebinar meeting console that you're hopefully looking at as you logged in. Feel free to jot in questions there if anything comes up as Neil is going. If we have time at the end, we'll do our best to get to questions that come up, and whatever we don't get to, we will provide a full question and answer document of everybody's questions and make sure everybody can see that. So if we don't get to your question, not to worry, we'll be sure to get back to you on that. So with that, again, thanks everybody for joining. Neil, thanks for joining us today. I'm so excited to hear about this again, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
All right, my pleasure. Thank you very much. And again, my usual sound check. Can you hear me clearly? Just a quick check.
Yep, loud and clear.
Very good. All right, nice. All right, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I think this is a cool topic. It falls into the sort of trends category, but it's a general trend that also applies to Flare. So I'll briefly introduce myself. I've been around for a while. I'm certified in various tools. I've been working in tech comms since '79, so I'd rather not do the math. But I started working in online and hypertext in '86, and I was a partner in a hypertext startup, and I personally created the second and third hypertext products ever released in the known universe, one of which was an online user's guide for MS-DOS 2.1. All right, so I've probably heard all the jokes, but feel free to toss some new ones out. I work with MadCap. I'm also an app consultant and trainer. And a couple of years ago, I did the lynda.com courses for Flare 11 and 12. So basically, that's me. So let's go ahead and look at what we're going to talk about today. What is Industry 4.0, which doesn't quite seem to have anything to do with Information 4.0, but in fact, it has everything to do with it. So we'll look at what these are, where they stand today. Can they be implemented today in general? And can they be implemented today in Flare, and to what degree? How might this affect Flare authors? And then, as I say, 4 major issues in general for technical communicators. So starting with this, what's Industry 4.0 and Information 4.0? So what's Industry 4.0? And Industry 4.0, as I say here, is a model for factory automation and data exchange that's coming out of Germany. It's been in process for a number of years, and the best quick description is to go to this site at Wikipedia and get a good overview of it. It is based very heavily on a number of technologies. One of the core technologies on which it's based is something called IIRDS. It's a standard for the Intelligent Information Request and Delivery. And it's being worked on in part by an organization in Germany called TCOM, which is interesting because it means that there's an organization that focuses on technical communication that's actually involved in setting standards. Plus, in addition to that, some other things that come into play, RDF, the metadata standard from the World Wide Web Consortium, IoT, the Internet of Things, AI, artificial intelligence, deep learning, the cloud, blockchain, and more. So this is a very highly technical, very complex standard that's being worked on. But where does TechCom fit into this? Well, if you look at that Wikipedia article, it discusses some of the design principles behind Industry 4.0, and one of them is this, and I'll just read it. Assistance systems for humans by aggregating and visualizing information to allow people to make quick decisions, informed decisions to solve urgent problems. And of course, does this sound familiar? And the answer is, yeah, absolutely, because it's what we in TechCom do. So if that's the case, what's Information 4.0? Well, it's the informational component of Industry 4.0. This is, it's basically a concept of advanced technologies and trends in TechCom. Some of them involve current technologies, some of them involve new technologies, and this concept was evangelized, or is being evangelized, by two guys in Europe named Andy McDonald and Ray Gowan, and they have formed a consortium with its own website and its own blog. It's the information40.org. A lot of good information up there. I've got several blog entries up there, and there are a number of others. There's a list of events at which Information 4.0 will be discussed. And Ray and Andy are always looking for members to expand the consortium. So after this is over, take a look. So, all right, that's good. What are we talking about? Well, again, as I say, it is, think of it as the TechCom of the future. A lot of what's involved in it exists today, and to a degree, Information 4.0 is simply a catchy name for existing and forthcoming technologies. But by putting them under one name, under one concept, it changes how we think of this stuff. And there are 7 main characteristics here. The content is independent of formatting and business rules and various other things. It's molecular. And every technology has its own jargon, and Information 4.0 is no different. We have information molecules that self-assemble into compounds based on state vectors. What on earth is this? It actually makes sense. Bear with me. Content is dynamic. It's continuously updated. You know that as soon as you finish a print document, it's out of date. One of the jokes about the old telephone book, the printed telephone book, is that it was out of date as soon as it was published, if not earlier. But the content, in some cases, has to be continuously updated, and this will let us do it. Offered. The stuff will be available if it's called for, if a user requests it. Ubiquitous, which means it's going to be everywhere. It will be searchable and hopefully findable. Spontaneous, triggered by contexts, and I'll explain what contexts are, and profiled automatically. So, all right, this is all good. What does this mean? Well, can it be implemented today? And can it be implemented today, and to what degree, specifically in Flare? Because I've been around for quite a while. I was involved in the very early hypertext days, as I said, and one of the things I've learned, and you may have learned too, is that the coolest technology around often is a cool technology that's used by a niche core user group. And what's really required to make a new technology expand beyond that niche is the presence of authoring tools. And the very first online help conference that I went to was held in New York City in 1991. It was put on by a company called WexTech, which at the time was the vendor for a tool called Doc2Help. And they invited every single person, every single online help author they could find. And 12 of us showed up. That was the entire universe. 2 years later, after the early authoring tools showed up, I was giving presentations at conferences where I might have 100, 200 people. And one of the things that made the difference was the tools. So that's perhaps my main focus here is, if Flare is a tool, what can you do? So first of all, the content has to be independent, because you don't know what platforms it might be used on, what tools, for what purpose. So the content has to be separated from the formatting, which means you don't do local formatting, which puts a huge premium on using things like style sheets. It has to be separate from tool-specific features. Every authoring tool, or almost every authoring tool around today, follows open standards, Worldwide Web Consortium standards, for example, but there are often certain tool-specific features that are added. The problem is those tool-specific features may cause trouble if used in another tool or another platform. And then finally, business rules. How do you create content that can be used by users in the US, Canada, the UK, and France in one project? And how does Flare support this? Well, the content is certainly separated from the formatting through the use of the CSS, the cascading style sheet. Local formatting is the source of most evil in the world, and you want to try not to do it. And if you do have local formatting, you want to try to get rid of it and replace it by a CSS. Independent from tool-specific features, in this case, Flare-specific features, roughly about 2 years ago, MadCap came up with a new output target called clean XHTML, and the purpose is to simply generate a target but strip out the Flare-specific features so that you can take that output and run it under some other tool, maybe a wiki, for example, in effect using Flare as an authoring tool. Business rules. Yep, Flare supports this through the use of conditional build tags. Tremendously powerful. I can control any output and specify for what audience, for what geographic region, for what client, etc. So yeah, Flare does a nice job right now of supporting independence. Molecular. Okay, what exactly does this mean? Well, it's topic-based authoring. Excuse me. It's topic-based authoring. That means that we no longer create one 500-page user guide. Instead, we create, hopefully, 500 one-page long chunks or fragments of content that we can string together on output like beads on a string in order to generate the different outputs according to the different business rules for different markets. In order to do this, though, the problem with this is that the number of fragments can grow quickly, and handling this requires a lot of software, powerful hardware, and very rigorous project management and standards. I do a lot of troubleshooting consulting for MadCap, and I often run into projects that have gone out of control, and I've been asked to come in and try to fix them. I even wrote a book about this last year about why you should document your projects, because if you don't, you're just asking for trouble. We may need AI, artificial intelligence, if we have to create and manage large numbers of fragments. I'll touch in a minute on what large numbers means. Assembly into compounds. In other words, we need to take all those chunks, those fragments of content, and assemble them into some sort of smooth, coherent document. And there's a number of standards out there for this. But again, probably the one that's going to be used for this, because it's the one that's being used for Industry 4.0, is the RDF standard from the Worldwide Web Consortium. And then finally, what's a state vector? Well, a state vector is a context state. Okay, that doesn't really explain much. What's a context state? A context state could be, is the outside temperature above or below freezing? am I standing here or am I standing over there 100 feet away? Because depending on where I'm standing, in other words, geolocation, I might need different information. How does Flare support this? Well, it supports topics, obviously. It supports snippets. It supports variables. And if you're not familiar with these, snippets and variables are subtopic sized chunks of content that can be used and reused in multiple places. The thing is, if you're dealing with snippets and variables, as I said, the number can grow quickly. The largest project I've worked on had 176,500 files in it, and the client was adamant that I add the 500 on the grounds that anybody could have 176,000. But one of their problems was that with this number of topics and some underpowered computer equipment, it was taking 24 hours to do a build in some cases. So large numbers of fragments, again, need standards, management. You have to document the process. Again, as I say, the largest one I've worked with, 176.5. I mentioned this to some guys I know from Denmark, and they made sort of noises and said, we're closer to 900,000. And at that point, I said, you win. But my theory is if the word thousand comes into play, it's a big project. Conditionality. Well, this is compounding fragments. And we can do conditionality in Flare quite easily. But the problem is we cannot add RDF tags yet through the GUI, which means if this is something you need to do, you need to go into code. What's a state vector? Contextualization, context, which in Flare is really context-sensitive help, which you've all probably done, and if you haven't, Flare supports it nicely. There is no support for other types of contextualization, which will require some kind of external scripting right now to make that work. And I'll, again, discuss some other types in a minute. Dynamic. This means that the stuff ideally will be continuously updated so as to always be accurate. Effectively in real time, that might not happen, but we're talking perhaps about updating, let's say, every half hour or every hour, or maybe every day, depending on the nature of the material, the nature of the changes. In order for this to work, the content has to be in an open database. It can't be local, sitting on your C drive, just because it's tremendously at risk sitting on your C drive. It can't be behind a firewall or some sort of login, some sort of paywall, because again, it's difficult for people to get through those walls. The compilation may also be a bottleneck. Again, if it takes 24 hours to compile, but users need the material updated every hour, obviously there's a problem. We need fast, reliable network access with local storage fallback. There are some wonderful shows from the UK on that are set in places like the Hebrides in northern Scotland, and the characters always have complete internet access, 5-bar cell reception, no matter where they are, whether they're in the middle of a town or standing out on a moor. The reality is, in many cases, we may not have that access, which means we're going to need local storage fallback with some dynamic means of updating the information once we get internet access. How does Flare handle this stuff? Excuse me a second. Sorry. So how does Flare handle this? Well, Flare has a batch target feature, which allows you to do, as I say, almost continuous updating in almost real time. You can set up a batch project and tell Flare to update and generate and publish the output and you can give it down to the quarter hour. But again, the targets have to be on servers to make sure that after the output is built, it can be pushed out to the users as quickly as possible without having to go through a firewall. Again, build time may be an issue because you want to minimize the build time, which means you may have to review some of your projects to see how big are they, why do they take as long as they do to build, is there anything that we can do to speed up the build time or reduce the size of the project. For example, if you do HTML5 movies, you might decide that it makes more sense to not embed those movies in your projects, but instead to put those movies up on your company's YouTube channel and link to them from the project. And again, you may have to use the clean XHTML output, which works pretty well, except for the fact that it may complicate the project design, because you might decide that, okay, maybe we want to use Flare's toggler feature, which is a very cool kind of link feature. But the question is, if you base your design around the toggler, what's going to happen when you generate the clean XHTML output, which turns off all the Flare specific features, including the toggler? How does that affect your design? All right. Offered rather than delivered. Basically, don't throw the information at the user, but make the information available and let the user decide when they want to get it, and give the information to the user in small chunks. How does Flare handle this? Well, it supports it now via context-sensitive help, which is fine. The problem is, in order to make information 4.0 work, Flare is going to have to support other types of contextual calls, which have not been defined yet and aren't yet supported through Flare. Ubiquitous. The stuff has to be available everywhere on multiple devices, which means it has to be online. It has to be searchable, especially because as we move into the HTML5 world with the top nav and side nav outputs in Flare, one of the things that we lose is the index, which means that your search mechanism, your search capabilities, your search engine optimization had better be good. How does Flare handle this? The responsive design feature works like a charm. Very powerful. It allows you to create one output that you can push out to a desktop, a tablet, a mobile device, and it's powerful enough that you can modify all kinds of features. You can modify how the skin behaves as the output is displayed on different devices. You can modify the structure of the content, such as shifting material, shifting graphics from, say, a horizontal format to a vertical format. And you can even change the text as the material goes to different devices, such as changing the word click to the word tap as the user just shifts the material, shifts from viewing the material on a desktop screen over to a tablet. Very useful. I gave a workshop at Macworld, fun with responsive design and Flare, and you can do all kinds of cool things today. Thing is, what about tomorrow's platforms? And I mentioned bots here only because for some reason in the last 9 months or so, bots have become very hot, chatbots. I don't know where bots are going to go. I don't think they're going to be adopted anywhere near as quickly as they're being presented. But the thing is, a bot may be a format that we have to support tomorrow. Again, you want to use the search engine optimization features in Flare, such as the meta description feature. This would seem to rule out hard copy and PDF, simply because they can be searched, but it's a little bit messier to make them searchable. So Flare does support this. All right, what about spontaneity? Well, the spontaneity has to be triggered by context. And again, and I've said this a couple of times already, but I'll mention it here in a little more detail. This goes far beyond the traditional context-sensitive help that we create, and it might include things ranging from device orientation. Is the user holding that cell phone in portrait mode or landscape mode? Geolocation, using GPS for external location or beaconing for internal location. And what I'm thinking about here, for example, might be material, perhaps a museum catalog that can detect where the user is standing in the museum and display the appropriate material for whatever exhibit the user is standing in front of. It could be external states. I mentioned this before, like temperature, but didn't say why. Perhaps you're doing an aircraft servicing or pre-flight manual, and the instructions have to change depending on whether it's above or below freezing. And what we can do is we could certainly create one manual with a table that says if the temperature is above freezing, follow these instructions, below freezing, follow those instructions. But there's a real risk, there's always a risk in something like that of the user misreading the instructions. What we'd like to be able to do is have an electronic pre-flight guide whose content can change dynamically based on the outside temperature. And this could apply to other things as well. Metal strain, for example, in something like a drill bit. In order for this to work, there's a number of things we need. Context detection. In other words, we need some way of figuring out, well, how is the user holding that phone? And that's easy. That's driven through the accelerometers built into the phone. GPS is pretty easy since most mobile devices have GPS chips built into them, and so on. But after we detect the context, we have to transmit it to some processing device, which is going to do the processing. And in order for that processing to work, in order for the processor to be able to figure out which content to use for the output, we need metadata. So again, metadata is a crucial thing here. How does Flare support this? Well, it's not totally spontaneous because of the need to run a build through Flare, although you can run the build through the command line, through the old MS-DOS prompt. There is no way right now, however, for a user request to trigger a build. In order to do this, we need a script, some sort of script that detects the context that you're looking for and sends that information back to the processor and says, hey, it's below freezing, please build the output accordingly. This would be one of these cases where if somebody really needs to do something like this, and if you can get your engineers to write a JavaScript that would talk to Flare, this might be an interesting business. Profiling. Generally, we think of user profiling, and we see this whenever you, for example, I see this when I go to Amazon and I get this message that says, welcome back, Neil. If you're not Neil, click here. But it can also mean profiling to an audience. This is going to require heavy use of analytics. If you don't do analytics now, it's a good time to start. And there's a model here. There's a concept from a company called Cognizant that they refer to as the data halo, which basically just means that there's this halo of data, search data, that surrounds us like a cloud. That information is there, and we should be creating it, and we should be tapping into it. So if you don't do analytics now, start thinking about it, because in the short run, analytics will help you analyze the effectiveness and the efficiency of your Flare project. In the longer run, it might allow us to do predictive analytics, to guess based on the data what information somebody's likely to ask for and present it to them. And again, how does Flare handle this? Well, between all the customization features, conditions, variables, snippets, etc., etc., I can almost, in fact, I probably could create one output target for me and one output target for Jennifer and one output target for somebody else. But this can quickly get messy. And it's also going to require, again, real-time or near real-time builds to make sure that the profile includes getting the information that I want when I want it. So where are we with all this? Can this be implemented today? And the reality is no, or at least not that I am aware of based on any tools that are out there. What we have is a bunch of tools, disparate tools, some of which are quite mature. Topic-based authoring, for example, is very mature. Predictive analytics is very mature, but not in TechCom. So, but Flare specifically supports some of the base technologies. It does support, obviously, topic-based authoring. It does support one type of contextualization, context-sensitive help. It does support customization through the use of JavaScripts. But we can take it further if you need to do something unusual, like coming up with that script for spontaneous demand generation. And it also supports structured authoring, depending on your definition of structured. This is a good opportunity to get into a debate with somebody at a conference. Just ask, what does the word structured mean? Three of us, a guy named Alan Hauser, Sarah O'Keefe, and I gave a panel discussion on the subject of what is structure at an STC conference in Philadelphia, I think in 2007. And we thought we would have 30 or 40 people. I think we had about 140 people show up to hear us debate what structured meant. So does structure mean data? Not necessarily. It could. But I argue that structure can just as easily mean a cascading style sheet and a series of information type templates. But you would have to decide what that means. And Flare supports this nicely now. So it's doable. The question is, how is this going to affect us? If you're a Flare user now, is this going to affect you tomorrow? Probably not, frankly. Is this going to affect you next year? Maybe, maybe not. But one of the things that we've learned over time is that just because something isn't going to affect me now, and it might, but if it's probably not going to affect me tomorrow, but it may affect me a year from now, so let's change how we work to make sure that we're prepared for when this new technology, this new methodology comes along, so that we don't have to scramble and go back and change the mistakes of the past. So some thoughts. It's going to affect how we create content. So you have to think topics and fragments. Fragments being snippets and variables. Don't think documents. And if you're working in Flare now, almost by definition, you're creating topics, because Flare is a topic-based authoring tool. You can use those topics to create documents, but you're not creating a document per se the way you would if you were working in Word or FrameMaker. Think about that dynamic wording. If you know that the material that you're going to be creating is going to be used on different say, desktops and mobile devices, think ahead about the wording and making that wording dynamic through the CSS. It could be click versus tap, and I actually put out a post about probably 6 months ago asking for other examples of text that might change depending on whether you were using a desktop versus a mobile device, and I probably got 40 or 50 responses. So click versus tap is the easiest one, but there's a bunch of others. Think about structuring your content organizationally. If you work as part of a group, or even if you don't, even if you work as an individual, it's going to be a lot easier for you if you can set up an organizational structure for your content, which in English might simply mean what headings do we use in what order and what goes in each heading for concept topics, task description topics, reference topics, troubleshooting topics. In other words, start creating templates for your content for different types of content. Structure content semantically. Again, start using metadata, start learning about taxonomies and ontologies, because this is the stuff that helps retrieval. Write and structure your content for outputs to multiple gateways, including bots. Well, all right, that's good. What does that mean? What's a gateway? Well, a gateway could be a desktop machine versus a tablet versus a phone versus a PDF, which would be read online, versus a PDF, which might be printed. So how does this affect you if you're a Flare author? Well, there's a very good example, which is when you're creating links between related topics. The standard protocol is to use hyperlinks because they're familiar, they're easy to understand. The problem is hyperlinks work fine, but they have a couple of problems, including the fact that when you produce, say, PDF, and the user prints that PDF, the links obviously don't work. So how do I find what I'm looking for? Well, instead of using hyperlinks, think about using cross-references, Flare's cross-references, to create links between content within an output target, so that when the user is running an online version of the information, the cross-reference will look like a link. Click here. But when they output to print, like PDF or Word, that same link changes to a page reference. For more information about widgets, see page 10, that kind of thing. So you're writing and structuring the content, taking advantage of the features that Flare offers, plus whatever you can think of for your specific content to make sure that that material works on multiple gateways. Technology, the more you know, the more technologically familiar you are, the better off you are, and frankly, the more valuable you are. So you don't need to be a CSS expert, but it's a good idea to understand what CSS does, how it works, maybe even have some understanding of it down at the code level. Think about following coding best practices. What does this mean? Well, it could mean several things. At a minimum, it means, excuse me, it means don't do local formatting. Use styles in a style sheet. Follow standards, including structural standards. And again, structural standards can be controlled by templates. Do you need data in this? And this is always its own topic. But I would argue that no, data is useful in certain circumstances, but in other circumstances, it can be heavy, cumbersome, and rigid, and it might actually cause trouble. Data vendors are trying to simplify data authoring tools, but it still takes a lot more, it's a more rigid format and requires much more control than you can do with a Flare project. We need a broader view of contextualization. In other words, it's not just traditional context sensitivity. And you may find that different people have different understandings of what context means, and you better make sure that you're talking about the same thing. So there's an education component. And I'll give you a quick example. I was the STC, Society for Technical Communications, lead representative to the Worldwide Web Consortium for about 4 years, back around 2003 through 2006. And at one point, I was in a meeting of a working group, the Device Independence Working Group, which is sort of a forerunner of responsive design. but the group was talking about context. And they were talking about things like, is the user holding the device in a portrait versus landscape mode? Is the user standing over here or standing across the street? And I just raised my hand and I said, are you guys familiar with context-sensitive help, context sensitivity, where depending on where the user is in a piece of application software, different online help might appear? And they said, no, never heard of it. And they were very nice. They carved 15 minutes out of the schedule for me to do an impromptu presentation on what this was. So when you say context, make sure the people you're talking to understand what you mean. Plus, if you have to create lots of molecules and manage lots of molecules, that may exceed what you can handle or what your group can handle, which means you may go into AI. You may start getting into machine-generated language, in which case our job is going to be less to write and more to write the rules that actually drive the machine generation and then check what the machines generate. In other words, we become less writers and more curators. Tools, keep your tools up to date. There's often a temptation to buy a copy of Tool X version 3, and then you decide to upgrade several years later and you're upgrading to Tool X version 9. And the problem is when you do that, it's not a smooth upgrade. It's not a smooth update. And there may be features in tool version number 3 that were slowly being phased out or changed in versions 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. But if you then go to version 9, that feature will have been phased out gracefully. But if you jump from version 3 to version 9, those old features may still be there, and you may have trouble. The tool may have trouble figuring out, what do I do with this feature which I no longer recognize? So think about a continuous update cycle. Start thinking about new tools. We tend to focus on the tools that we use today because our focus is today and in the short range. But start thinking about as your needs may change. Do we need to go to new tools like, let's say, natural language parsers? I say this all the time, there's a crucial need for training in how to use the tools. And there's a certain amount of self-interest here since I do a lot of training for MadCap. But the problem is I get a lot of people who are self-taught, often to a really impressive degree. The problem is that, number one, you may have figured out a way to perform some tasks that takes 34 steps when I could show you how to do it in 3. Also, if you do self-training, you're learning the mechanics, but not necessarily getting involved in design issues. And finally, peer-to-peer training, which a lot of companies do because it's cheaper, but this often perpetuates errors from one developer to the next. And the training will get you up to speed fast. All right, finally, 4 major issues to look at here. Actually, I'll back up one slide when it comes to training, and I'll throw out one story which I'm very fond of about why training is good. And again, if this sounds like I'm hammering training, I sort of am, because it's a good way to get up to speed fast. But several years ago, I got a call from a very nice lady in San Francisco. I had no idea who she was. She had no idea who I was. But her company had bought her Flare, but they didn't want to train her. They said, you figure it out. So she had been trying to do some task in the style sheet, couldn't figure out how to do it. She did a Google search for Flare consultants, found me, called me up, and she explained what she wanted to do. And I said, how long have you been trying to figure out how to do this? And she said, 10 months. And I said, okay, are you in front of your computer? Yeah. Do you have Flare running? Yeah. Are you in the style sheet editor? Yeah. And you see there's this option on the toolbar. Yeah. Click the option and you see item 3 or whatever it was, And there was a moment of dead silence, and she just said, "Oh, bleep, thank you," and hung up. So sometimes saving money through not training can have some bad ramifications. That said, 4 major issues here. If you're going to get involved in information 4.0, or for that matter, any new technology or methodology. Number one, biggest thing, does it support my company's strategic and business direction? I find that a lot of people are often working on a technology or want to get into a technology because it's really cool and we can have a lot of fun. The problem is it doesn't really do anything for the company. It's not supporting the company's strategy. It's not helping the company make money or reduce costs. And the company will just drop it because there's no real support for that technology. So whatever you're doing had better support the company. The problem is there's a lot of things that may be proposed that really support the company's strategic and business direction, which means that all the different people who are pushing these cool ideas have to get support from top management. Because without that, it's just never going to work. If you don't have top management muscle behind you, it's not going to work. Even if you do have top management behind you, the idea may not work. But having top management behind you is a big help. Does your company's culture support this? This can be a huge issue because I've been in places, you may have been in places where there was some cool technology, but the company's culture just didn't support it. It could be that it was a low-tech company. I have been in places which were hard copy-based doc groups, word shops, or frame maker shops, for example, and they wanted to go online, so they might go to Flare or they might go to some other tool. But the problem is everybody who had been working there for years, who had a huge base of knowledge about the tool they were doing, suddenly found that that knowledge was useless because we're not using that tool. And I've been in a number of places where within a year, after a switch from print to online, the entire doc group had turned over. I was in a company last year that asked me to do some consulting about moving online. And one of the things I suggested was you guys need to start keeping metrics about work speed, various other types of metrics. And several of the groups fought me hard because the company's culture just didn't support metrics because people had a fear of metrics and of being measured. Are things clearly defined in the company? You would think that everybody would use a particular term to mean a particular thing, and if you do, you'll be disappointed. I've been in places where people use the word mobile to mean 3 different things. I have been in places where, you know how Flare creates an output called web help. And I've been in places where there's real confusion over, is it web help 1 word or web help 2 words? And they sound the same, but the problem is that they're 2 very different things. And I've seen projects go off the rails because of this terminology or semantic misunderstanding. So you have, again, there's an educational component. All right, I talk about these things periodically in my blog. I just listed here. So let me sum this up. Much of what we've talked about is still conceptual. And frankly, it might wind up being called Content 4.0 or something. I have no idea what. Information 4.0 is still largely at the conceptual and definition stage, although, as I've said, we are seeing concrete evidence of its being implementable. But it is a huge increase in the technical side of TechCom. And some people have trouble with this because there are 2 competing schools of thought in TechCom. There's the writing, the content creation group, which says that the tools are irrelevant. What's important is that you be able to write. There's the tools side, which says that that's fine, but if you don't have the tool, you can't disseminate what you've written, so it's being wasted. And this has been a tug of war within the field for decades. It still is. This is going to push a sharp increase in the technical side, like adding geolocation. I'm doing things now that I had never heard of 5 years ago. And I suspect that very few people are doing geolocation right now. But 5 years from now, a lot of people may be. But probably the most important thing is that it opens up a lot of new paths and opportunities going forward for Flare in particular and TechCom in general. So with that, I will say thank you. Here is the usual blatant sales pitch slide. And I'm going to pass this back to Jennifer for a moment.
Great, thank you, Neil, so much. That was wonderful. Just a quick reminder for everyone: we're continuing on our promotion this month for Flare and Central, where you can save over $200 on a very handy bundle, which includes a subscription of Flare, a license of Flare, a central author seat, and a subject matter expert seat. So if you've been wanting to get into this platform, it's a great way to do it and save some money. And of course, it's scalable, so it's really easy to add on as your team grows. If you have any questions about Central, how it works, what it looks like, what it all means, feel free to contact us at sales@madcapsoftware.com or reach out to me personally. I'm happy to help with that. And that's running through the end of July. And then the last thing I want to remind everybody is that we have our Mad World Europe conference coming up in the middle of September. It's going to be the 11th through the 14th. This is our first time doing a conference in Prague, so we're excited to support our European community. And of course, anybody who wants to make the journey across the pond from here in North America, we would love to see you. Through July 31st, we do have a $200 registration discount. So I would encourage you to check out the conference schedule, the speakers, what we're doing. Centrally located in Europe there, so hopefully we'll see you there. It's going to be a lot of fun. And then I think we're getting, if anybody has any questions, feel free to drop them in. You touched a little bit, Neil, on supporting in the future and what we need to do. Any comments or thoughts on from the Flare side of things? And you kind of touched on this, but what sorts of, maybe you could just recap again, what sorts of technologies within Flare are there to support this effort now, and what would be interesting to see in the future, and your thoughts to support it even more?
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing, probably one of the most important things that MadCap has added, is the reports feature in Flare and the analysis feature, which was added in Flare 2018. Which helps you keep track of your project. I find that a lot of people are not familiar with the reports feature and are not familiar with the analyzer tool or the analysis feature, but those two will go a long way toward helping keep the project under control. Another useful thing is Central. MadCap Central, which is a version control system with some project management features, which I expect to see expand over the years. So that's a very useful way to, again, help keep track of, help manage your project. Beyond that, what I'd like to see is more information, more reports controlling how I merge projects. I would like to see the ability to add other types of metadata. I think those two would make a huge difference because they would allow us to start experimenting with creating information 4.0 sort of style outputs from Flare without requiring a programmer or without requiring us to be programmers.
Yeah.
That I think would be a huge difference. There's been a trend in Flare over the years of taking features that 10 years ago might have required you to go into code, and now making that a point-and-click feature on the GUI, which makes it simpler. And the more these features become simple, the easier they are to use. And I expect to see that trend continue. Yeah, so I'd say a combination of tools and call it design philosophy from MadCap.
Right. Good. You were talking a bit about the future and current use of dynamic wording, depending on what you're looking at. The click versus tap situation. And you mentioned that there was a list of words where that would apply, and we had a question about, could you maybe give a couple more examples of that, and is that something that we, could those ideas maybe be provided in the follow-up to the recording?
In fact, what I'll do, since a couple of people have asked me about this before, and I just haven't had time to do anything about it, but what I'm thinking I will do is actually write a blog post listing those terms.
Perfect.
If that would
Yeah,
help.
I think that would be really helpful. I think everybody would welcome that. And another, maybe one quick one here before we go, and you again, you kind of touched on this, but any recommendations for starting to work with RDF, or that the standard that you mentioned?
Yeah. Any recommendations for starting to work with the RDF, which, by the way, stands for Resource Description Framework? There are books out there about RDF, and probably the best place to go, frankly, would be the World Wide Web Consortium site, w3c.org, and look up RDF. I will say that RDF is not simple. It's really code-oriented, and there are some tools out there that make it easy to use, but conceptually, it takes some getting used to. Of course, everything else we do has taken getting used to conceptually as well, so RDF is one more thing. But what I can do, in fact, is add some discussion about RDF to that blog post.
That'd be great. I think it'd be very helpful. Well, again, we're at the top of the hour here, and so I want to thank you, Neil, again for joining us today. This was really informative, and I'm sure everybody enjoyed it. I want to thank all of our guests for joining us for this hour once again, and I hope you'll visit our website again. We'll have we actually have a couple more live webinars on the site, and we'll continue to add them as we schedule them. So do check back to our website, and again, we'll be sending this out as a recording. So want to wish everybody a wonderful rest of the week. Thank you again, Neil, for taking the time with us today, and hope to see you all on the next presentation. So have a good one. We'll talk soon.
Thank you very much. Hope
Thanks,
this has
Neil.
been useful. Take care.
Take care.